Hello, and welcome to a brand new day of free-to-play here on Magic the Gathering Arena. Get the dish on the latest with me, Lord Rumfish. I'm talking about blue. Wilds of Eldraine blue cards. This is the Deckbuilding Toolbox series. And just in a nutshell, I want to go over cards that I don't have a specific deck list for you. These are all ideas. They're all nuggets of ideas and cards that can serve a wide variety of roles or that act as jumping off points to get into deck building. So with that being said, let's go ahead and dive in here. Sleight of Hand has not been in standard for a little bit. We have lots of 1-mana spells in blue that do a little bit of card filtering and replace themselves. Sleight of Hand is good because you always see 2 cards, one of which goes in your hand. So, it might not be as strong as like Preordain or Brainstorm. Sleight of Hand is a sorcery. It's a very good spell though. It's just a good option to have in your toolbox. So I would go ahead and craft this card if you don't already have it in the collection. Snaremaster Sprite, this is a budget option. If you want to get off the ground with a Fairies deck, then what you need to know is that Fairies loves to get on the board. You need to get on the board as early as turn 1. Now, if you have rares to spare, you could go for the 3/3 Ward 2, comes in with 3 stun counters on it, that Fairy. If you don't have the rares to spare, then this is like your 1-drop in blue. Black's got a 1-drop, and those'll get you where you need to go, so you can turn on your other fairy spells. This one has the added modality that you can tap a creature and put a stun counter on it. That could come up. It's a reasonable tempo play. It's also reasonable just to get down a 1/1 flyer on turn 1, so you have a fairy in play. Bitter Chill is pretty good as blue removal goes. It's just 2 mana, taps the enchanted creature, doesn't untap, and when this is put in a graveyard, you can pay 1 to scry 1 and draw a card. So if you have mana open when that creature dies, it can replace itself. Now, you're not very likely to make that creature die in the blue deck, but your opponent may very well be able to barter it, sacrifice it, in some way get rid of that creature, legend rule it. If you happen to have the mana open at the time, then you can get a scry and a draw. Yeah, this is good, reasonable blue removal. You may or may not want it, but the price is right. Spell Stutter. This is a great counterspell. Quench has been playable in the past. And if you have at least 1 fairy in play, it turns into a mana leak, and then quickly more than a mana leak. So, I've only played with the spell a little bit, and it's been stellar. So, yeah, if you have any desire at all to run fairies, this is going to be great. If you don't have a single fairy in your deck, then there are better options. But it still wouldn't be unreasonable. Storm-Keld Prowler. So this one is interesting because you only need to trigger it once to make it above rate. Right, if you trigger this card even once, one time it becomes a 4/3 for 2, and at that point it's pretty great. Obviously, if you trigger it more than once, it's going to be fantastic. There are ways to get discounts on your spells. Here's a couple that come to mind. There are the rare cycle from Kamigawa, where you can pitch cards in your hand to reduce the overall mana cost of X. If X was 4 or more with those, then it would be mana value 5 or greater. Another one, if you made a blue-black deck, there's a couple of black spells where you can sacrifice a creature to reduce the cost of the spell. The spell would still be a 5 mana cost spell though, like destroy target creature, exile target creature, stuff like that. or gets reduced down if you pay 1 black and sacrifice a creature. That would also trigger this. I'm just saying there are ways to get 5-mana spells on discount. And this card has plenty of deck building synergies and opportunities to it. You could also just put it into our ramp deck. I don't know if that would be the best use of it, but you know, you could run, what's it called, Up the Beanstalk, whatever, for 2 mana and green. It's got the mana value 5 or greater clause. You can run this, and then I think you could put together a pretty reasonable deck around that theme. Overall, I like this card, and it gets my, you know, brain ticking as far as deck building. So, it's just a common. Quick study. This card is pretty obviously excellent. Being switched over from a sorcery to an instant means that it's a completely different spell than a divination. You can hold open your counter magic and your creature removal and all of your interaction, and if the opponent doesn't do anything you need to respond to, you draw 2 cards for 3. This is potentially better in a multicolor deck than the one that lets you discard a basic land, otherwise you discard 2. In a monocolor deck with a lot of islands, you know, that spell's probably better. But this spell, if you're blue-black or a 3-color deck or what have you, you may not have that many basic lands. And even though you won't see as many cards, you will always keep the 2 you draw. And I think that would make this a better spell in those cases. So, it's just a common. I would go ahead and craft it. Tenacious Tome Seeker is an interesting one. You can bargain it, which you really want to do. But it's not hard to set up a situation where you can bargain it and want to bargain it if you're constructing the deck. So, you know, you need to sacrifice an artifact, enchantment, or a token of some kind. And then you get to return an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. That ability being on a 3-mana creature, which is a reasonable battlefield presence, like, no one's going to say that a 3/2 is great on the battlefield, but it's also not unreasonable. It trades relatively well in combat, threatens the opponent relatively well, and as long as it's regrowing you a spell, it's doing good work. Just something to keep in mind. Ice Out is a 3-mana counter spell, which can be a 2-mana counter spell, like the original. You have to bargain it in order to do that. It can reduce its cost down to 2. So the question of whether or not you can play this in your deck for a 2-mana counter spell, that depends on what else is in your deck. I can think of plenty of ways that you could meet the condition for the bargain, though. So it's a neat one. You know, you have to build around it, but that's kind of the point here. We want a toolbox of cards to have deck ideas for, to go in a variety of decks. This one's just common, and gets me thinking, well, what artifacts and enchantments and things can I put into my blue deck to power this up? I think it's pretty good. Galvanic Giant. So there's been a combo, well, kind of a synergy, but still a powerful interaction in Standard recently, with people using Invasion of Alara to sort of cascade, as it were, into the Bramble Familiar and play its adventure side. The same would also be true of Galvanic Giant, not as powerful in this case. Right? You don't get something onto the battlefield for free when you do the storm rating. But you do draw 4, discard 2. Can put some nice things into your graveyard, lets you see 4 cards. You know, like if you wanted to run like 4 Bramble Familiar and 1 Galvanic Giant, just so you have like one other option as a hit in that deck, then there could be board states where you might prefer to choose the Galvanic Giant once in a while. The creature side of it is reasonable. It's not great, but as long as you're getting the storm rating, then the creature is just kind of added upside. So this is, you know, mana value 5 or greater thing. When you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, you tap target creature an opponent controls, put a stun counter on it. That's not bad. It's not a bad ability. Tacked on to the draw 4, discard 2 could be pretty good. So if you were outside of the Invasion of Alara deck, I still think you could maybe find some decks that would run a 7 mana draw spell like this that has added upside on it. I don't know that you would ever want 4 copies though. So I find the spell interesting, but I don't know if there would ever be a deck that wants all 4 copies of the card. I'm going to craft 2 here. Johann Stopgap. So this one's an interesting deck building consideration as well. You can get the cost down to 2 by bargaining it. Can return a non-land permanent to its owner's hand and draw a card. That could be yours. Could be your permanent. You could reset a Saga. There are neat things that this card can do. I don't think it just has to be like a tempo play where it, you know, replaces itself, bargain something away. You could set up something where you want to bounce your own thing. And maybe drawing a card with this spell, maybe the thing you were playing already drew a card. You know, that could be its own kind of weird form of card advantage there too. I feel like this spell is better than it looks. It looks goofy with the art, but I think it could be pretty reasonable. Into the Fey Court. Being at 5 mana, I'm not sure if you would ever need to run like 3 or 4 copies of this. But draw 3 cards is a powerful line of text. It also makes a 1/1 fairy. It can only block creatures with flying, but still it's putting a body on the field, drawing you cards. That has historically been a good combination of effects. You know, getting a body on the field and drawing cards. So it would be better if it could block any creature, for sure. But I still think this one could be powerful enough to see play. Certainly a good budget option. Alright, Balluna's Gatekeeper. So I like this for the adventurer side of the card specifically. It's something you could run in a budget version of the Invasion of Alara deck, which it's hard to run that deck with a budget because you need like the Invasion of Alara and then you need the Bramble Familiar, and those are both rares, I believe. So you're already down a lot of rares if you want to build that deck. But if you want to populate that deck with some, you know, cheaper options that would still go well on the theme, this is a spell that the Invasion of Alara would not hit, and lets you do something at the early stages of the game. And just, overall, I think it's maybe not quite powerful enough for other types of decks in Standard, but it's close. It's not far off. If you have a deck like the Invasion of Alara, you might find a home for some copies of this. Maybe I like the card more than I should, but I feel like there are deck building possibilities with this card, and I appreciate it for that reason. Alright, Rowdy Research. We have a 7-mana instant. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature that attacked this turn. Draw 3 cards. So, if the opponent is attacking with a bunch of creatures, drawing 3 cards might not matter if you're losing the game. But there's also the possibility that you are the player who's attacking with a bunch of creatures and drawing 3 cards, in which case you're definitely winning the game. There could be some middle ground in there where you know, you need to find an answer, but you can afford to take this one hit, you know, from, I don't know, a white aggro deck. You get the cost down to where you can draw the 3 cards, you find the board sweeper, you play it on your next turn. Looks pretty good in that situation. The card will be awkward sometimes, but if you have the ability to turn this card on with an aggressive start, then you could use it proactively. And I'm just going to say here that it would not be the worst to cast the spell for 5 or 6 mana and draw 3 cards. It is an instant. You can do that at instant speed. It's not crazy to imagine that 1 or 2 creatures could be attacking you. And that, it wouldn't be powerful in that case, but it would be fair. It'd be a fair card at 5 or 6 mana. So, all the way around, I think it's a pretty reasonable card draw spell. We have a lot of them in Standard, so it's hard to say if it's going to see play or not. I think it's worth testing, though. Alright, that brings us to the end of the commons and uncommons. Let's take a look at the rares and mythics. Alright, time to craft some cards here. 8 commons, 8 uncommons, I'm okay with that. So, Sleep Cursed Fairy. This is a card that I think you're going to want if you're building the Fairies deck, and you have the rare wild cards to spare. I understand if you don't have the rare wild cards to spare. We went over the budget option down at Common. But if you can craft this card, it can untap pretty quickly, especially if you can spare an activation to use it once to pull a stun counter off of it. Turns on all of your fairy spells, turns into a big threat. And the fact that it has Ward 2 means that it's very difficult for the opponent to get rid of this with anything short of a sacrifice effect. And they need to have that right on time, right on curve, if they want to hit you with it. Otherwise, you'll probably get other fairies out. You could sack them instead and leave this one around. It's no joke. It's a pretty serious threat. Ingenious Prodigy, I'm not sure about this card yet. I haven't tested it very much. But I'm interested. I'm curious. So, seems like in a big ramp deck that this could be a neat spell. The other thing that this is interesting for is a ninja deck, right? So, if you get down a 0-1 with Skulk on turn 1, it's very, very difficult to block it. Your opponent basically needs a 0-power creature. And some of the only 0-power creatures I remember people running in this format, there's the green creature, taps for mana and gets oil counters. It has 0 power. Once in a while you'll see Concealing Curtains in black. And aside from those, I think most of the time this is going to be unblockable. Which means, you know, you can attack with it, get a ninja onto the board, and then later, you have more mana. So if you wanted to, you could play this out as a much bigger creature later in the game in your ninja deck. You can also just get it down for 1 again and keep getting more ninjas onto the field. If you want to do ninjas with it, you should maybe craft all 4 copies. It seems like it'd be really good there. You know, if we had Ornithopter in the format, I'd tell you to do Ornithopter, but this is a close second. And if you're going into a big ramp deck or whatever, you know, you can get this giant creature onto the field, draws you a card every upkeep. Seems good. But, well, it needs more testing. We'll see. Extraordinary Journey. So this, oddly enough, I want to draw a comparison to Meathook Massacre because you don't have to pay the X. You could just get it down as an enchantment for 2 blue. Alright, because it has an interesting effect on the battlefield. Meathook Massacre did as well. And this one's not legendary. It says, whenever 1 or more non-token creatures enter the battlefield, if 1 or more of them entered from exile, or was cast from exile, then you draw a card. The ability triggers only once each turn. I know it's not in the colors, but this makes me think of Rocco. Rocco, the chef that was printed in Aftermath. You know, just you and the opponent are just putting stuff out from exile all the time. You know, Rocco's putting out +1 counters and making food. If you had this card down, I know that would be difficult. Or I know the mana doesn't match up cleanly. Just saying that if you did have both of them on the battlefield, you would also be drawing a card. And Rocco was kind of already drawing you cards, right? And then the opponent could be drawing you cards if they're using the cards from Rocco. And, you know, you don't have to use Rocco. You could use this in like a blue-red deck. Red likes to draw cards through the, you know, exile. You can play it until the end of your next turn kind of thing. You could run those spells with Extraordinary Journey, and you could be drawing a lot of cards, right? You're getting the extra cards from the red exile spells, then you're actually drawing cards off of this blue spell. You could see a ridiculous number of cards, it seems like, if you can get that to work. So, on top of all of that, right, we've just been talking about it as a 2-mana enchantment so far. It has this other thing it can do. If you pay XX, so, you know, 4 mana, 6 mana, 8 mana, etc. It can exile up to X target creatures. For each of those cards, its owner may play it as long as it remains exiled. Most of the time you would want to use that as a tempo play against the opponent. And when they play them back out, they're drawing you cards because of this card being on the battlefield. You can also use it on your creatures. That is more of a corner case. I don't think most of the time that your opponent's doing so little that you can afford to just start exiling your own stuff for value, but you could. And if you're really late in the game, you know, your opponent's got 2 things over there that you want to slow down. You've got some little thing like, oh, you know, the dog that draws you a card. Then, if you have the mana, yeah, you could exile both the opponent's things. You could also exile your dog. Now you'll draw 2 cards when you replay that dog. This is an interesting card to me. I don't know if it's going to make it in Standard or not, but it gets my deck building brain ticking. Talion's Messenger. So people have said this isn't as good as Raffine. That might be true, but Raffine has 3 colors. And Raffine is legendary. Talion's Messenger, you can have multiples on the battlefield. And I can vouch that that is very powerful when you do. The card filtering works very well for a fairies deck. It's not the worst blocker. And Talion's Messenger in particular works very nicely with Fairy Vandal. If you have Fairy Vandal on the field, then attacking means you're going to trigger the Fairy Vandal. And the Fairy Vandal's going to get a counter, and then this is going to put out a counter. So, if you're running a Fairies deck and you're thinking about using Talion's Messenger, I would say this card pairs extremely well with Fairy Vandal. I would run them in the same deck. But even if you're not, this is a very reasonable fairy. It's very good. Farsight Ritual. So we have better options in Standard. You know, there's the flashback spell, where you can pay 7, and for the amount of mana that you put into it, you see that many cards. This will be in Standard for a long time, though. So I don't know if you need it right now, but it's maybe something to think about for the future. And for what it's worth, it does let you see 8 cards all at once, which does go deeper than just about any other blue card draw spell that isn't X in its cost. Looking 8 cards deep, yeah, maybe if you've got a combo deck, something like that, it would be worth it to you to see 8 cards deep for 4 mana. Maybe that would suit your combo deck better than other options that exist in Standard. And just maybe, you have a sacrifice theme deck that actually like the bargain trigger on this more than other spells. There are some like corner case, edge case scenarios where I think this could be a better card draw spell even in the current Standard, and it will be in Standard for a long time. So I don't know that you should go out of your way to craft it, but be aware of it. Virtue of Knowledge, this one I'm throwing out here as, you know, if you look at this card and you're like, oh my gosh, I could copy the activated ability of Evolving Wilds or something, and you're like, you immediately start having deck ideas when you see this card, then by all means, go for it. There are lots of funky activated and triggered abilities that you could be copying with this. And then it's got the whole, you know, permanent entering the battlefield doubling up. If you know that you like to build this kind of deck, if you know this kind of card gets your deck building brain triggering, then you should go for it. You know if you're that kind of person who likes to make that kind of deck. I'm not so much, but I respect that this is a powerful card, and that there may very well be something that would be extremely good to copy the triggers on, even for 2 mana, let alone for 5. That's up to you. It's a puzzle for you to solve. That's kind of the joy of what deck building is all about. Fairy Slumber Party, I have good news. I got 4 copies of this card, I believe, from the Mastery Tree. So this is one of the Mastery Tree cards that you can get. It returns all creatures to their owner's hands for each opponent who controlled a creature. In a 2-player game, that's just going to be 1 opponent. You make 2 fairy tokens with flying that only block flyers. So it's nice that this leaves you ahead on the board. Right? You've bounced all the opponent's creatures, you get creatures down at the same time. And that's very nice. And again, you could be getting value off of this by bouncing creatures to your hand that gave you value in the first place. So you can make this card more than the sum of its parts when you build around it. It's You know, it's not exactly a sweeper, but maybe it's good enough. Maybe it does what you need it to do. You know, it could even be the case that you want to go into a big ramp deck. It's like, well, I know I advocate for spells that cost a lot of mana sometimes, but hear me out here. If you get a big ramp deck, right? Let's say you, you know, play your 3-drop, fetches you a land into play, the Topiary Stomper. You're ramping up, the opponent is, you know, blitzing stuff out onto the field. You get up to 6-7 mana, you bounce everything, buys you a little bit more time. You get to replay the Topiary Stompers and get more land, more value out of those early drops that you put out. Or maybe Azusa's Many Journeys. You know, you pick up the 3/3, now you can play it out again as the enchantment, gain some more life, maybe hit extra land drops. Late in the game, maybe you're picking up Titan of Industry and you're hitting its triggers all over again. I'm not saying you have to, I'm not saying it's necessary, but a card like this could have utility like up the curve in the ramp deck when you like need it to survive, and late in the game when you're re-triggering all of your giant ramp monsters. I see a lot of scenarios where this could be a good card. I don't know if it'll make it in Standard, but I see potential. And if you buy into the Mastery Tree, you can unlock this card very easily. Horned Lockwhale. This is good. This is good. It's not an aggressive card, because you can't put a blocking creature on top or bottom of their library. It's only an attacking creature. So this is not really for a tempo deck, right? This is more of a control piece. Maybe mid-range. I could see it in a kind of a mid-rangey deck too. But yeah, since you can't clear a blocker out of the way, this has a narrower thing that it does, but let me just say that all of the cards start in your library. Putting them back there effectively is the same as losing them. Right? You've moved them from the game zone of like the hand or the battlefield somewhere else. Now they're gone. Maybe the opponent can get it back, but for now it's gone. And that means that it is a 1-for-1 trade on the Lagoon Breach. I just want to point that out. Putting something back into the library is moving the game zones, putting the opponent down a card. Right? They can't just freely get any card they want out of their library. They have to draw them. So you've set them back. Then you get a 6/6 whale. It can't be a flash blocker, but it can be a sneaky kind of haste attacker that the opponent was not expecting. It has ward, so it's, you know, not impossible to deal with, but it's hard to deal with. Overall, this is a strong card. I think it can serve a variety of roles in a variety of decks. Don't think you're going to put it into tempo or aggro. But mid-range and control, I think, can both definitely see play with this card. Or ramp. I could see this having a home in a ramp deck. Maybe not ramp just because you have even bigger targets to ramp up to than a Horned Lockwhale. You could do worse, though. It would help keep you alive in the earlier part of the game. And the other thing I'll say in a ramp deck is you might have 8 mana, which means you could Lagoon Breach and play the Horned Lockwhale on the same turn. That could be a big deal. I'm going to go ahead and craft 3 rares and 1 mythic here. So let me see. I am very interested in the Extraordinary Journey. So I'm going to craft one of these. Horned Lockwhale also seems like a very flexible card. I'm going to craft one of these. I've got a ways to go, but I do like the look of the Fairies deck, and I think this card could go in other styles of deck potentially as well. I'm going to go ahead and craft a copy of the Sleep Cursed Fairy. And I'll craft a Virtue of Knowledge. I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to do with it. Might be copying some land triggers, who knows. But let's go for it. Alright, that wraps up for blue. So join me next time when I will be going into black. We're going to cover black, red, green, and then finally multicolor at the end. So, like, subscribe, check out my other videos. Checking out the other videos is the big one. And until next time, never stop honing your critical thinking and empathy.